Let's start. 242, Chapter 16 Number. Analysis. Species that are found in only one area are called endemic species and are especially vulnerable to extinction. They exist on islands and in other unique small areas, especially in tropical rainforests where most species are highly specialized. One example is the brilliantly colored golden toad, once found only in a small area of lush rainforests in Costa Rica's mountainous region. Despite living in the country's well-protected Monteverde Cloud Forest Reserve, by 1989, the golden toad had apparently become extinct. Monteverde Cloud Forest Reserve, 1989. Much of the moisture that supported its rainforest habitat came in the form of moisture-laden clouds blowing in from the Caribbean Sea. But warmer air from global climate change caused these clouds to rise, depriving the forests of moisture, and the habitat for the golden toad and many other species dried up. The golden toad appears to be one of the first victims of climate change caused largely by global warming. MTC. Good job. MTC. Let's start. 242, Chapter 16 Number. 01. If you drive down a busy street, you will find many competing businesses, often right next to one another. For example, in most places a consumer in search of a quick meal has many choices, and more fast food restaurants appear all the time. These competing firms advertise heavily. The temptation is to see advertising as driving up the price of a product without any benefit to the consumer. However, this misconception doesn't account for why firms advertise. In markets where competitors sell slightly differentiated products, advertising enables firms to inform their customers about new products and services. Yes, costs rise, but consumers also gain information to help make purchasing decisions. Consumers also benefit from added variety, and we all get a product that's pretty close to our vision of a perfect good, and no other market structure delivers that outcome. MTC. Good job. MTC. Let's start. 242, Chapter 16 Number. 02. When evaluating a policy, people tend to concentrate on how the policy will fix some particular problem while ignoring or downplaying other effects it may have. Economists often refer to this situation as the law of unintended consequences. For instance, suppose that you impose a tariff on imported steel in order to protect the jobs of domestic steel workers. If you impose a high enough tariff, their jobs will indeed be protected from competition by foreign steel companies. But an unintended consequence is that the jobs of some auto workers will be lost to foreign competition. Why? The tariff that protects steel workers raises the price of the steel that domestic automobile makers need to build their cars. As a result, domestic automobile manufacturers have to raise the prices of their cars, making them relatively less attractive than foreign cars. Raising prices tends to reduce domestic car sales, so some domestic auto workers lose their jobs. MTC. Good job. MTC. Let's start. 242, Chapter 16 Number. 03. A common but incorrect assumption is that we are creatures of reason when, in fact, we are creatures of both reason and emotion. We cannot get by on reason alone, since any reason always eventually leads to a feeling. Should I get a whole grain cereal or a chocolate cereal? I can list all the reasons I want, but the reasons have to be based on something. For example, if my goal is to eat healthy, I can choose the whole grain cereal, but what is my reason for wanting to be healthy? I can list more and more reasons, such as wanting to live longer, spending more quality time with loved ones, etc., but what are the reasons for those reasons? You should be able to see by now that reasons are ultimately based on non-reason, such as values, feelings, or emotions. These deep-seated values, feelings, and emotions we have are rarely a result of reasoning, but can certainly be influenced by reasoning. We have values, feelings, and emotions before we begin to reason, and long before we begin to reason effectively. MTC. Good job. MTC. Let's start. 242, Chapter 16 Number. 04. The right to be forgotten is a right distinct from but related to a right to privacy. The right to privacy is, among other things, the right for information traditionally regarded as protected or personal not to be revealed. The right to be forgotten, in contrast, can be applied to information that has been in the public domain. The right to be forgotten broadly includes the right of an individual not to be forever defined by information from a specific point in time. One motivation for such a right is to allow individuals to move on with their lives and not be defined by a specific event or period in their lives. For example, it has long been recognized in some countries, such as the UK and France, that even past criminal convictions should eventually be spent and not continue to affect a person's life. Despite the reason for supporting the right to be forgotten, the right to be forgotten can sometimes come into conflict with other rights. For example, formal exceptions are sometimes made for security or public health reasons. MTC. Good job. MTC. Let's start. 242, Chapter 16 Number 05. If DNA were the only thing that mattered, there would be no particular reason to build meaningful social programs to pour good experiences into children and protect them from bad experiences. Dina. But brains require the right kind of environment if they are to correctly develop. When the first draft of the Human Genome Project came to completion at the turn of the millennium, one of the great surprises was that humans have only about 20,000 genes. Human Genome Project, 2. This number came as a surprise to biologists. Given the complexity of the brain and the body, it had been assumed that hundreds of thousands of genes would be required. So how does the massively complicated brain, with its 86 billion neurons, get built from such a small recipe book? 860? The answer relies on a clever strategy implemented by the genome: build incompletely and let world experience refine. MTC. Good job. MTC. Let's start. 242, Chapter 16 Number 06. One interesting feature of network markets is that history matters. A famous example is the QWERTY keyboard used with your computer. QWERTY. You might wonder why this particular configuration of keys, with its awkward placement of the letters, became the standard. The QWERTY keyboard in the 19th century was developed in the era of manual typewriters with physical keys. 19 QWERTY. The keyboard was designed to keep frequently used keys, like E and O, physically separated in order to prevent them from jamming. EO. By the time the technology for electronic typing evolved, millions of people had already learned to type on millions of QWERTY typewriters. QWERTY. Replacing the QWERTY keyboard with a more efficient design would have been both expensive and difficult to coordinate. QWERTY. Thus, the placement of the letters stays with the obsolete QWERTY on today's English language keyboards. QWERTY. MTC. Good job. MTC. Let's start. 242, Chapter 16 Number 07. The ancient Greeks used to describe two very different ways of thinking: logos and mythos. Logos, mythos. Logos roughly referred to the world of the logical, the empirical, the scientific. Logos. Mythos referred to the world of dreams, storytelling, and symbols. Mythos. Like many rationalists today, some philosophers of Greece prized logos and looked down at mythos. Logos, mythos. Logic and reason, they concluded, make us modern; storytelling and myth-making are primitive. But lots of scholars then and now, including many anthropologists, sociologists, and philosophers today, see a more complicated picture, where mythos and logos are intertwined and interdependent. Mythos, logos. Science itself, according to this view, relies on stories. The frames and metaphors we use to understand the world shape the scientific discoveries we make; they even shape what we see. When our frames and metaphors change, the world itself is transformed. The Copernican revolution involved more than just scientific calculation; it involved a new story about the place of Earth in the universe. MTC. Good job. MTC. Let's start. 242, Chapter 16 Number 08. There is no doubt that the length of some literary works is overwhelming. Reading or translating a work in class, hour after hour, week after week, can be such a boring experience that many students never want to open a foreign language book again. Extracts provide one type of solution. The advantages are obvious. Reading a series of passages from different works produces more variety in the classroom, so that the teacher has a greater chance of avoiding monotony, while still giving learners a taste at least of an author's special flavor. On the other hand, a student who is only exposed to bite-sized chunks will never have the satisfaction of knowing the overall pattern of a book, which is after all the satisfaction most of us seek when we read something in our own language. Moreover, there are some literary features that cannot be adequately illustrated by a short excerpt, the development of plot or character, for instance, with the gradual involvement of the reader that this implies, or the unfolding of a complex theme through the juxtaposition of contrasting views. MTC. Good job. MTC. Let's start. 242, Chapter 16 Number 09. When trying to sustain an independent ethos, cultures face a problem of critical mass. No single individual, acting on his or her own, can produce an ethos. Rather, an ethos results from the interdependent acts of many individuals. This cluster of produced meaning may require some degree of insulation from larger and wealthier outside forces. The Canadian Inuit maintain their own ethos, even though they number no more than 24,000. 2-4. They manage this feat through a combination of trade, to support their way of life, and geographic isolation. The Inuit occupy remote territory, removed from major population centers of Canada. If cross-cultural contact were to become sufficiently close, the Inuit ethos would disappear. Distinct cultural groups of similar size do not, in the long run, persist in downtown Toronto, Canada, where they come in contact with many outside influences and pursue essentially Western paths for their lives. MTC. Good job. MTC. Let's start. 242, Chapter 16 Number 10. In one survey, 61% of Americans said that they supported the government spending more on assistance to the poor. 61%. But when the same population was asked whether they supported spending more government money on welfare, only 21% were in favor. 21%. In other words, if you ask people about individual welfare programs such as giving financial help to people who have long-term illnesses and paying for school meals for families with low-income, people are broadly in favor of them. But if you ask about welfare, which refers to those exact same programs that you've just listed, they're against it. The word welfare has negative connotations, perhaps because of the way many politicians and newspapers portray it. Therefore, the framing of a question can heavily influence the answer in many ways, which matters if your aim is to obtain a true measure of what people think. And next time you hear a politician say surveys prove that the majority of the people agree with me, be very wary. MTC. Good job. MTC. Let's start. 242, Chapter 16 Number 11. We commonly argue about the fairness of taxation, whether this or that tax will fall more heavily on the rich or the poor. But the expressive dimension of taxation goes beyond debates about fairness, to the moral judgments societies make about which activities are worthy of honor and recognition, and which ones should be discouraged. Sometimes, these judgments are explicit. Taxes on tobacco, alcohol, and casinos are called sin taxes because they seek to discourage activities considered harmful or undesirable. Such taxes express society's disapproval of these activities by raising the cost of engaging in them. Proposals to tax sugary sodas, to combat obesity, or carbon emissions, to address climate change, likewise seek to change norms and shape behavior. Not all taxes have this aim. We do not tax income to express disapproval of paid employment or to discourage people from engaging in it. Nor is a general sales tax intended as a deterrent to buying things. These are simply ways of raising revenue. MTC. Good job. MTC. Let's start. 242, Chapter 16, Number 12. When we think of culture, we first think of human cultures, of our culture. We think of computers, airplanes, fashions, teams, and pop stars. For most of human cultural history, none of those things existed. For hundreds of thousands of years, no human culture had a tool with moving parts. Well into the 20th century, various human foraging cultures retained tools of stone, wood, and bone. 20. We might pity human hunter-gatherers for their stuck simplicity, but we would be making a mistake. They held extensive knowledge, knew deep secrets of their lands and creatures. And they experienced rich and rewarding lives. We know so because when their ways were threatened, they fought to hold on to them, to the death. Sadly, this remains true as the final tribal peoples get overwhelmed by those who value money above humanity. We are living in their end times and, to varying extents, we're all contributing to those endings. Ultimately our values may even prove self-defeating. MTC. Good job. MTC. Let's start. 242, Chapter 16, Number 13. When an important change takes place in your life, observe your response. If you resist accepting the change, it is because you are afraid of losing something. Perhaps you might lose your position, property, possession, or money. The change might mean that you lose privileges or prestige. Perhaps with the change you lose the closeness of a person or a place. In life, all these things come and go, and then others appear, which will also go. It is like a river in constant movement. If we try to stop the flow, we create a dam, the water stagnates and causes a pressure which accumulates inside us. To learn to let go, to not cling and allow the flow of the river, is to live without resistances, being the creators of constructive changes that bring about improvements and widen our horizons. MTC. Good job. MTC. Let's start. 242, Chapter 16, Number 14. The invention of the mechanical clock was influenced by monks who lived in monasteries that were the examples of order and routine. They had to keep accurate time so that monastery bells could be rung at regular intervals to announce the 7 hours of the day reserved for prayer. Early clocks were nothing more than a weight tied to a rope wrapped around a revolving drum. Time was determined by watching the length of the weighted rope. The discovery of the pendulum in the 17th century led to the widespread use of clocks and enormous public clocks. 17. Eventually, keeping time turned into serving time. People started to follow the mechanical time of clocks rather than their natural body time. They ate at meal time, rather than when they were hungry, and went to bed when it was time, rather than when they were sleepy. Even periodicals and fashions became yearly. The world had become orderly. MTC. Good job. MTC. Let's start. 242, Chapter 16, Number 15. Since we know we can't completely eliminate our biases, we need to try to limit the harmful impacts they can have on the objectivity and rationality of our decisions and judgments. It is important that we are aware when one of our cognitive biases is activated and make a conscious choice to overcome that bias. We need to be aware of the impact the bias has on our decision-making process in our life. Then we can choose an appropriate debiasing strategy to combat it. After we have implemented a strategy, we should check in again to see if it worked in the way we had hoped. If it did, we can move on and make an objective and informed decision. If it didn't, we can try the same strategy again or implement a new one until we are ready to make a rational judgment. MTC. Good job. MTC. Let's start. 242, Chapter 16, Number 16. Habits create the foundation for mastery. In chess, it is only after the basic movements of the pieces have become automatic that a player can focus on the next level of the game. Each chunk of information that is memorized opens up the mental space for more effortful thinking. This is true for anything you attempt. When you know the simple movements so well that you can perform them without thinking, you are free to pay attention to more advanced details. In this way, habits are the backbone of any pursuit of excellence. However, the benefits of habits come at a cost. At first, each repetition develops fluency, speed, and skill. But then, as a habit becomes automatic, you become less sensitive to feedback. You fall into mindless repetition. It becomes easier to let mistakes slide. When you can do it good enough automatically, you stop thinking about how to do it better. MTC. Good job.